All right, so let's take a look at the inverse function. So if you have a function that's denoted by f of x, the inverse of this function is denoted by f to the minus 1 power of x. And the way you would read this is f inverse of x. So how do we find the inverse? So the steps to find the inverse function is to first replace the f of x with y. Second step is to switch x and y. And the reason why I've highlighted this in red is because this is the step that actually gives you the inverse. Step 3 is to solve for y, and step 4 is to replace y with the proper notation, which is f inverse of x. Let's look at some inverse function properties. So if you have a function, when you compose a function with its inverse, the result is the identity function, meaning it returns the original input. What does this all mean? If you take a function and you plug in the inverse function, the output is whatever this number is. So whatever this number is that you're plugging in, that's the output. The same thing happens if you switch them. So if you take an inverse function and you plug in the original function, whatever this input x is the output. So essentially these are going to be identical. They're going to output the same value. So the domain of the inverse function is the range of the original function and vice versa. What does that mean? So if you have a domain of some function f, right, that's equivalent to the range of the inverse of this function. So in other words, if you take the inverse of this function f, the inverse would have the same range as the domain of the original function. And if you were to switch that around, and say the domain of the inverse function would essentially be the range of the original function. The last property we have here is a reflection property. So the graph of a function and its inverse are reflections of each other across the line y equals x. So if you have some function f, it can be any function. If you take this f of x function and you reflect it over the line y is equal to x, you will get the inverse function. Okay, so if you take f of x reflected over y equals to x, and you get the inverse function. I've wrote that here. F of x reflected over y equals x gives us the inverse function. So let's find the inverse of this function. So the first step is what? Replace f of x with y. So here I would write this as, y is equal to 2x plus 3. And then you would switch x and y, so you would have x is equal to 2y plus 3, and then you would solve for y, right? So to solve for y, we're going to subtract 3 on both sides. You're going to have x minus 3 is equal to 2y, and you're going to divide both sides by 2. So you're going to have x minus 3 over 2 is equal to y. And the final step is to write it with proper notation, and that's to replace y with f inverse of x. So y, which is going to be replaced with f inverse of x, is equal to x minus 3 over 2. So this is the inverse function, and this is your original function.